Okay, we have started recording.
Okay.
If you don't mind, I'm going to just pop up there real quick. Would you? Well, first I want to say thank you to everybody for coming out tonight. Who here, this is your first time in Blunt Mansion? Well, welcome again. We're very excited to have you guys here. I'm going to turn this over. We're going to have him talk to us today. I apologize. I didn't say your name. Dr. Fazier?
It's not doctor, just a lawyer. Akram Fazier. That's my name.
Akram Fazier. He's here to talk to us about the U.S. Constitution today. So again, thank you so much for coming out, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rose. I'm very honored. And thank you all for being here. I'm very honored that the Blunt Mansion has invited and honored our LMU Law School with this invitation and honored me as well. And I'm thrilled to have all of you be here. I know you have one thing in life that you can't get more of is time, right? So for all of you to share your time, it's very kind of you. So I hope I can make it worthwhile. So here we have, anyone know who this is? It's the dollar bill, right?
Yeah.
Right? He was our first president, but was he? Right? Let's go back in time. Here's the problem with democracy. Ben Franklin said, democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. Right? And that explains what our framers thought about democracy. They were very dubious about that. Right? They thought it was a license to, right, overreach. He says liberty, which is not necessarily democracy, right, is a well-armed lamb contesting the vote. So it evidences to us, right, that the ancient Greeks' idea of liberty was democracy. That was liberty to the ancient Greeks. Our framers had the idea that liberty was in tension with democracy, and that explains much of how our constitutional framework works. Okay? So today's Constitution Day. Delegates in Philadelphia signed the U.S. Constitution on September 17, 1787. It's a holiday that was really started by Senate Majority Leader Robert Byrd of West Virginia. Right? West Virginia was one of course, considered one of the great senators, but he had an equivocal history too. He filibustered the Civil Rights Acts. Right? He, as a younger man, was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, but he also raised some very, very important things in his long career as a U.S. Senator from West Virginia. And it's thanks to him we honor this day, September 17th. But I just said that Washington was our first president. This actually was our first president. It was John Hanson of Maryland, because Hanson was actually the first president chosen by the Continental Congress, right? That came into existence in 1777. Okay? And the Continental Congress basically had this rule. There was no bicameralism like we have today. It was one Continental Congress composed of delegates from each of the 13 states. Okay? Anyone knew how the delegation was composed? How did they compose it?
Landowners, wasn't
It was, but this was the strange thing. It was each state got one vote in the Continental Congress. In other words, the most populous state at the time, Virginia, which had 13 times the population of Rhode Island, got one vote, and Rhode Island got one vote. And each state could send as large a delegation as it chose, but a majority vote of the delegation determined how that one vote was given. Okay? And the Continental Congress was seen as a failure. Okay? But I want you to think this through. It's agreed to in 1777. At the time of the Continental Congress, white Americans had, by a good margin, the highest living standards of any sizable population in the world. Okay? So white Americans who had just won their independence were not some fledgling basket case. It was not like Afghanistan of yesteryear. It was the population of the world with the highest living standards. Okay? It also quite successfully negotiated a peace treaty with the United Kingdom that saw the United Kingdom basically cede all the land below what we now call Canada, through, right? That basically includes all the places, right? Michigan, Ohio, all that, basically the Ohio Territory as it's called, was successfully negotiated by effectively John Adams as part of a peace treaty with the UK. No mean feat, right? I mean, Adams just, right? So in other words, they successfully negotiated a very favorable peace with the UK, and things started to be working effectively for them. Right? For example, they had finally come to an agreement that forced each state to pay its fair share of taxes. As you know, taxes are our Achilles heel as Americans, but each state had agreed to that, right? But it was sclerotic in some ways as well. Proposed amendments could only come from the Continental Congress, nowhere else. Each state had a right to veto any effort to alter the Articles, and any legislation coming from the Continental Congress required unanimity. All 13, and it was not majority vote, all 13. And in many ways, our Constitution was a rebellion by the larger states against the smaller states. In other words, Virginia was like, we're sick and tired of this. You guys in Rhode Island were sick of your veto. Right? Notice how many of our founders were Virginians, right? And that's not first, that, right? None of our founders were from Rhode Island, right? Okay? Right? In fact, Rhode Island took the position, this was treason. We had negotiated Articles of Confederation that allowed for one means of amendment, which was through the Continental Congress, and we agreed it was an irrevocable union that can only be amended by way of one means, which is the Continental Congress. But our framers chose a different route. Okay? And so there's a guy named Bruce Ackerman. Okay? He's at Harvard Law School. And he writes that the US had a system of constitutionalizing charisma. We had our framers, right? And we decided to use Washington as our means. Please come in. Yeah? Oh, my screen went. It's not a good thing. Well, there we go. We chose Washington. Can I ask you, what was so great about George Washington? What have we learned? What was so great?
General Revolutionary War.
General. Okay. Was he a great general?
Did they do
He lost every battle, right? Right? They say he never told a lie. Is that true? Of course not, right?
He was tall.
He was tall. He was trusted.
Unlike Virginia.
He was actually one of, I think, the great genius things behind Washington. He was so far removed from the political thicket, each faction could see what they wanted in him, right? That makes sense? Okay, that was one thing. Also usefully, right, unlike Benedict Arnold, who was a much more capable person than Washington, he was never a traitor to the country, right? And also very fortuitously, all the difficulties of the Articles of Confederation, Washington had removed himself from. In other words, he went back to Mount Vernon, went back to his estate, and he left the problems of the Articles of Confederation to everybody thereafter. Right? Make sense? So one of the things that was so useful about Washington is that he didn't really want power too much. Right? He had a noble hit. In many ways, Washington to us Americans is our version of de Gaulle. Think of de Gaulle, right? He is the leader of the Free French. Does he win any battles against the Nazis? No. Right? Was he necessary to the, right? To D-Day and those whole operations? No. Was he necessarily a great general? No. But in 1945, he leaves the scene and leaves the Fourth Republic to the feuding parliamentary system of France and comes back in 1958. A very similar timeline for Washington. Okay? He was untainted by the Articles. Okay? So here's our Washington. Okay? And so Ackerman says that the US constitutional system was a goal of constitutionalizing the charisma of Washington via a process called charismatic re-engagement to support Madison's illegal constitutional convention. Crazy, you know, they're calling this Constitution Day. But it was really, from many people's perspective, legitimately seen as an illegal convention, right? Because we had a system now, we said we'd amend things, and we bypassed it. Okay? Right? Madison and Hamilton were effectively calling for a revolution against the perpetual union established 5 years earlier. The Articles authorized only the Continental Congress and no one else to amend the Union. This is why Rhode Island denounced the convention as illegal. But they're right, aren't they, Rhode Island? Now, they negotiated themselves a great deal at the Articles, right? But maybe they negotiated themselves too good a deal, right? The proposed constitution provided that a new government would come into existence with the ratification of 9 states. which was, remember, a new constitution with the ratification of 9, that's in direct contravention of the article saying amendment can only come by once 13 have agreed to it. Okay? So as Dr. Liskey did, he read the Constitution. It's less than 8,000 words. Can be read in less than half an hour, and it will bore you to death. Okay? It was proposed for ratification in Philadelphia and signed by 39 eminent men. And recognizing the racial hierarchy of the time, the sex hierarchy of the time, it was more democracy than the world had ever seen up to that moment. Right? And as I said earlier, white Americans had the highest material living standards of any significant population worldwide. Okay? The framers created 3 branches of government that required checks and balances. So think of what that means. For a law to be effectively implemented, at least 2 must concur, right? At least the Congress, right, and the courts, or the president and the Congress, right? And so the framers were very concerned about reducing the likelihood of tyranny by dispersing power. As I said earlier, our framers' idea of democracy was in tension with freedom. It was not like the ancient Greeks who saw democracy and freedom as synonymous, right? They weren't like nationalists, right? Like, for example, think of today, this very day, think of a Palestinian nationalist or Israeli nationalist. They believe self-government makes you free. Our framers said, okay, but self-government is there, but that doesn't necessarily make you free. Right? Article 1 refers to both houses of Congress, Article 2 to the President, and 3 to the Supreme Court. In that order, I think, because the framers understood and felt that the Congress was the most important branch. So now we see our own Congressman is Tim Pritchett, right? He is a very important person in our system of constitutional government. Right? He's not a mere congressman, he's our closest federally elected official who's closest to the people. Right? Now, in Article 1, it says, the Constitution for the United States of America, as opposed to a Constitution for the people of America. Right? So in other words, what the Constitution is basically conceding is that we're made up of constituent states who are being asked to come to a party, as opposed to a constitution for constituent people. It's kind of akin to think of the European Union, which is a union of European member states, more so than a European population. Right? That makes sense? It writes here, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress. What does that mean? It's kind of confusing. Anyone have any idea? What it means is the states can pass a law for any reason they want. Tennessee can pass a law saying the drinking age is 18 or 21. It can say you have to be this age to get married. It can tell you have to have car insurance to drive a car. But if Congress wants to enact a law, it has to have authorization in the Constitution that gives the Congress that power. And in many ways, our politics to this very day is a partisan dispute as to whether that power is there or not. Okay? Article 1 refers to the Congress consisting of 2 houses, a House of Representatives and a Senate. And think about how important that is, right? I mean, of all the major countries in the world, how many do have a truly bicameral system? Right? Most countries like Canada, the country of my original citizenship, they have an upper chamber called the Senate, but it's appointed. And all the Senate really does in Canada is advise the House of Commons. It doesn't ever seek to veto what the House of Commons does. It merely acts as an advisory body to help the House of Commons. Think of the House of Lords in the UK today. It's largely an advisory body that supplements what the House of Commons does. Right? Think even in the French system or the German system, which are bicameral, in neither system is the upper chamber that powerful. But in the United States, just about every member of the House, with the exception of the Speaker, will probably resign their seat to be a member of the Senate. Right? And think about how complicated that makes legislation in our country. Is it really easy, for example, for President Trump to obtain legislation in the House and then overcome the hurdles in the Senate to get to 60? The reason, for example, the president today is using so many proclamations, executive orders, and the rest is partly because this hurdle is so high, right? If he could easily get 60 in the Senate, plus he then would probably use the Congress more often. But that's such a high hurdle. It says the House term is 2 years, and members are chosen by people of the several states according to the laws of each state based on qualifications for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. That's a mouthful, isn't it? What does that mean? Anyone? It means the framers never gave us a right to vote. It merely says that your ability to vote for Congress is going to be determined by whether you have the ability to vote for your state legislature. And so if your state legislature doesn't allow black people to vote, or doesn't allow women to vote, or doesn't allow poor people to vote, then you can't vote for Congress either. That makes sense? It's determined by the state legislature. Each House member must be 25 years of age, a U.S. citizen for at least 7 years, and an inhabitant of the state from which they are elected. Which means, right, you can live in Memphis and represent Knoxville, right? Or you can live in Knoxville and represent Memphis. It means that someone like myself, who's now 51 turning 52, I can be a member of the House because I've been a citizen for more than 7 years. And why do you think they insisted on 25 years of age? Why not just let anybody do it, like an adult? They were concerned about dynastic politics. They were concerned that people will inherit seats as opposed to have some personal merit to run on. Right? So our framers, they were concerned about like an India phenomenon, right? That you have people with a dynastic politics. It says representative taxes are to be apportioned between the number of free persons and 3/5 of all other persons. We know what 3/5 of all other persons means, right? That means slaves. And it's a compromise they worked out. In other words, Virginia wanted more representation, but it didn't want to pay more taxes. But notice by implication, it also evidences that our framers understood slavery to be wrong, right? Because if they thought it was right, they would have just used the word slaves, right? But to say all other persons reveals some level of shame. Right? So here's William Charles Cole Claiborne, and Claiborne County in Tennessee is named after him. And he actually was elected to the House at age 21, which means at the founding, we didn't always abide by every rule precisely. Okay? He was allowed to take his seat. Okay? It says that each state has at least one representative, and the number cannot exceed 1 per 30,000. Okay? This means that Congress can substantially increase the number of representatives from the current 435 to over 1,200 if it wanted, right? So at the time of the founding, we had a large number of congressmen. We've not increased that number since 1929 with population. So today, the United States has a very, very low representative rate. We have 435 members of the House for a population of 340 million people. To give you an example, France has 577 members of the National Assembly for 65 million people. Britain has nearly 700 members of the House of Commons for about 70 million people, right? So Germany also, a much lower, right? The only other country with a lower representation rate than us is India, right? It says that enumeration, look at this, this is quite genius. Enumeration will be by decennial census. Think about how genius that is. They forced our country to take a census. It's a hard thing to do. And one of the reasons, like in Lebanon, it's against the law to take a census. When the French ruled Lebanon, they gave the top spot, the president, to a Christian Maronite, the number 2 spot to a Sunni Muslim, the prime minister, the number 3 spot to a Shia Muslim. And the French took a census at the time in the 1940s and saying that the Maronite Christians were the most populous group. Today, though, because of outmigration of Lebanese Christians, right, they live in the West and they do very well in the business communities of places like Los Angeles, Paris, right, Sydney, Australia. There are fewer Christian Maronites, and the largest demographic group is actually Shia Muslims. But it's against the law in Lebanon to take a census because the fear is it will, right, it will overturn the constitutional order. Our framers forced us to confront demographic change, which we still struggle with, but notice we have to do it, right? It says the House shall choose its speaker and has, as we've discussed several times, the sole power of impeachment. Okay? Impeachment is to remove or try an executive official. Okay? It came from the British system. Now let's go to section 3. Senators are to be 2 from each state and chosen by the state legislatures. So think of a great senator like Daniel Webster, right? Think of Henry Clay. Nobody voted for them. They were chosen by the legislature, Henry Clay in Frankfort, Kentucky, and sent to Washington. Okay? It was only in 1913 that the 17th Amendment allowed senators to be elected by the people. Okay? They are chosen for 6-year terms. They must be at least the age of 30 and a United States citizen for at least 9 years, and an inhabitant of the state from which they are elected. And the answer is the same. Avoiding dynastic politics, and they wanted it to be 30 because they wanted to choose someone slightly more eminent. Okay? It says the Senate shall have the power, sole power, to try all impeachments, and no conviction shall be entered without the concurrence of at least 2/3. Notice when they say sole power to try all impeachments, what they're saying is no one should be able to second guess whether the Senate gave a fair trial. If the Senate wants to give a partisan witch hunt trial, no one can question that. Right? That makes sense? You hear sometimes, like Bill Clinton when he was impeached, he said, they're not offering me a fair trial. Right? But it's not for him to say. Okay? The vice president shall be Senate president and will break tie votes. Right? Notice Kamala Harris, when she ran, she said, I did this, I broke the tie vote, but that was her job, actually. Right? She didn't have discretion to do that. Section 3 says, judgment in cases of impeachment. Let's just take a look at this. Judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. But look at this. But the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law. You all read that, right? Take a moment of that. Right? But the Supreme Court, in the case Trump v. United States, took the position that a sitting president who's been impeached cannot be subsequently prosecuted. Right? Which tells you, right, that even one of the things about our Constitution is the meanings can be elastic enough for subsequent interpretation. But to my mind, this language seemed pretty clear-cut, that it allowed his subsequent prosecution, right? But I was wrong. Okay? Here's Joe Biden. Now, we all see him as really, 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 really old. But he actually was elected to the Senate below age 30. Right? And there he is, right? He was elected to the U.S. Senate from Delaware at 29. Right? But he was allowed to take his oath as well. It says here, the framers gave us this, election date shall be set by law. Think of that too, how that restrains the government's power, right? In most countries, the sitting government approaches the monarch or the president and says, I'd like to call an election for this day. But our president can't do that. Right? I want you to think about it. Imagine if Trump had an extra month in 2020 to have the election. He would have, imagine if he had waited till Operation Warp Speed worked and the COVID vaccines came and then he had the election, he would have won, wouldn't he? Right? Would have been a much more likely re-elect. But he was stuck with the November 3rd date, wasn't he? And he probably was driven crazy by the fact that the vaccines weren't authorized. Right? He was like, ah, right? Okay. Or think of President Obama in 2014. He probably lost the Senate because of the Ebola scare at that very moment. Remember that? That was the Ebola scare. He would have loved to put off the election by a month as well. Right? But our presidents can't do that. It says each house shall be the judge of its elections and may determine the rule of its proceedings. Okay? None of us can question whether the election that led to the election of Speaker Johnson was legit. It's just up to the House. Okay? Once they elected him, there's no judicial review. There's no, oh, you coerced a vote or you bribed him, right? In the United States, once you hold office in the executive branch, you can't be a member of Congress. Okay? Now that's different than other countries. Okay? Like in France, you can be a mayor of Bordeaux and the prime minister of France. Right? Okay? For a long time, Jacques Chirac was the president of France and the mayor of Paris. Think about that. Okay? But in the United States, if you hold a seat in Congress and you want to be a part of the executive branch, you have to resign your seat. And sometimes that can be unfair. Like think of Jeff Sessions. He had a very safe seat from Alabama in the US Senate, guaranteed re-elect, and a serious senator, right? Not a joke senator. He gave up his seat and within a few months of being President Trump's Attorney General, fired. Right? Lost his seat, everything. Right? That is the American system. It says now when a revenue bill is a way of saying a tax. They say it has to come from the House. Why would our framers, you think, have said that a tax must come from the more populous and the branch that faces the voters as opposed to the Senate?
No taxation without representation?
That's true. And what did they say?
More frequent elections so they get held more accountable for their actions.
In other words, you better have a lot of confidence to raise taxes. Right? And the framers saw a resource to government with taxes as a threat to your freedom. And look at this. Congress has the power to override a veto by 2/3 of each house. In other words, the Congress can make the president a nullity and enact a law. The two most recent examples of this was in the 1980s. The Congress overturned President Reagan's veto and forced the government to enact sanctions against apartheid South Africa. And then it also happened with the Clean Water Act. Nixon vetoed that, and the Congress overrode Nixon's veto to make the Clean Water Act the law. Okay? So what powers, right? I said legislative power comes from the Congress, has to come from the Congress. What powers are there? Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes and spend money for the general welfare. So for example, what's something that we all spend money, what does the government spend money for the general welfare today? What's the Social Security? That's an example. Okay, that comes from Congress. What else? Medicare, Medicaid subsidies to the states, student loans, interstate highway funds, right? Federal education subsidies. Okay? That all comes from Congress. But notice it comes from Congress, not the president, right? The argument we're having now is how much power does the president have to control that money that Congress has approved? Now, one thing the Articles didn't have, which this Constitution has, is granted Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce. That makes sense? So it used to be, under the Articles, each state could say, no, we don't want your goods in our state. And so imagine in today's world if there wasn't that. Kentucky would say no Jack Daniel's whiskey in our state. It's junk. It's low. It's like, right? It's like whiskey for amateurs, right? And Tennessee would say, sorry, we're no bourbon in our state, right? No Kentucky bourbon. It's too sophisticated, right? It's going to get people turned into drunks, right? And that we'd have constant barriers, wouldn't we? There'd probably be people at the border between, right, Georgia and Chattanooga keeping goods out. And our framers understood that would happen if you didn't give the power to Congress to regulate commerce. Okay? So when I grew up in Canada, there was not this provision in the Canadian British North America Act. And as a result, when you were in a Canadian province, they would have restrictions. You couldn't buy certain beers right? So if you want, my parents lived in Cornwall, Ontario, and there were certain beers from Quebec or New Brunswick you couldn't buy in Ontario because of restrictions. So if you wanted to have access to all the beers, you went to Messina, New York, right? Where everything was available, because Canada and the US had a free trade agreement. Okay? Congress has the power to coin money. Notice does that mean Bitcoin is against the law? That make sense? Why would we allow Bitcoin and crypto? Congress has the power to establish uniform rules of naturalization and bankruptcies. Now, what does that mean? What does naturalization mean? Becoming a citizen. So why would we give that power to Congress, you think? And make it uniform? Why not just leave it to the states? Hey, we like you. It's the conjunction of giving people freedom of movement, right? So by making sure that it's a national uniform standard of naturalization, you're assured that no one got a cut-rate path to citizenship, right? Similarly, a uniform rule of bankruptcy means you can't get out of a debt by threatening to move to South Carolina, right? So it used to, if you didn't make it uniform, people would say, I'm going to move to Louisiana if you don't let me have an advantageous bankruptcy, right? And Louisiana has the cut rate rule. So Congress did that. A power to establish a post office, we have that, right? The U.S. mail. We always think about the U.S. mail as like a crazy, it's outdated in many ways. All of us use automatic bill pay. But think about the founding, what it meant, right? You could send a letter all the way to North Dakota from Knoxville for the same price as a letter next door, right? It helps cohere the country. Constitute inferior tribunals to the Supreme Court. In other words, Congress can disestablish all the 94 district courts. They could say there's a Supreme Court, but the rest of them are getting rid of. Right? Declare war, raise and support an army, and then this is the thing. This is the big 800-pound gorilla. To make laws necessary and proper to implement these powers. Okay? So this is the big question, right? 1819, there was a case called McCulloch v. Maryland. And the question was, did Congress have the power, based on that, to set up what was basically a precursor to the Federal Reserve? Because there's nothing here that says you can set up a Federal Reserve, right? And in the decision, the Supreme Court said that we're going to interpret this broadly and say that having a Federal Reserve is helpful to do these things. Okay? The opposing side, the Jefferson side, was that power is not there. Right? That makes sense? But can you see how it could be an open issue? So the necessary and proper clause, think of it this way. The liberal view would mean, right, if I give my daughter my car keys and say, use it as a necessary and proper means to go to work, the liberal view is you can go to work, but on your way, stop at McDonald's, right? Have a cheeseburger, then go to Dairy Queen, have a shake. Maybe after that, go visit your boyfriend, right? Go to work, come back, stop in the park, go for a walk, and then come home. The conservative view is get your rear end to work and come right back. And you can't stop on the way, right? That makes sense? Okay. That's still at issue today, right? That makes sense? Clarence Thomas takes the position that necessary and proper limits power, doesn't expand it. Okay? Most of the other justices take the other view. Okay? Section 9, it disallows Congress from banning slavery before 1808. Another piece of evidence we see slavery as wrong, right? You're not going to put in your text, you're contemplating banning something unless you see it as wrong. And it says Congress cannot suspend the writ of habeas corpus unless required for public safety in cases of rebellion or invasion. So what does that mean? Do you remember the TV show Night Court? Remember that one? That was the writ of habeas corpus. Because they were arresting people in New York City, and to justify holding them in jail, pending a trial, you had to bring them before the judge and say, this is why we're holding them. Other countries don't have, like France, you can declare, the president can declare a state of emergency, and you could hold people incommunicado, in prison, in jail for a long time without trial. In our system, you have to do this. Okay? There can be no bill of attainder or ex post facto law. What does that mean? A bill of attainder is what happened to Socrates, a legislative punishment. Right? We're punishing you because we don't like you. Can you imagine if there was a vote in Congress to determine whether, who's an unpopular person? Really? Jeffrey Epstein. Can we agree Jeffrey Epstein would have faced immediate death penalty from Congress, right? But you can't do that. You have to try it before an impartial magistrate, right? Even though the legislature would love to sink their teeth into him, or Bernie Madoff, right? Everyone blamed him for a gazillion things, but you can't just do that. Okay? And an ex post facto law is why no one went to prison for the financial crisis, okay? Because what at the time of the financial crisis, what they did was not illegal. It was merely irresponsible. Okay? And then no money drawn from the treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. So think about President Trump. He wanted to build a border wall, right, with Mexico, and you're going to love it. Notice if Trump wanted to, he could have set up a GoFundMe, and tons of people would have donated to the wall, wouldn't they? Here's a couple of billion, rich people would have done it, poor people would have done it, everyone would have donated. But that wouldn't have, you couldn't have used that money if people tried to fund the government that way. The government can only act if Congress approves a bill appropriating the money. See that? And Congress didn't appropriate money for a border wall. Because you need both houses, right? No state shall pass a law impairing obligation of contracts. Now notice that everything we have until now has been about giving states something. How about dinner, drinks? Like free furniture. But this one says no state. It's a restriction on states. Why do you think the framers said that no state shall impair the freedom, the obligation of contracts? Any idea?
I think it's kind of hierarchical, that Articles of Confederation, the states had the ultimate power.
Yeah.
With this new federal government,
Yeah.
is more supreme overall.
Yeah. Very good. It's also kind of like each state is like kind of on eHarmony, and they're checking their partners for credit checks. See that? There's like someone going on a date with someone, you find out they got bad credit. Right? So they want to make sure that no state in the union can undermine the full faith and credit by being a massive debtor, the Louisiana, right? That makes sense? Okay. Now we get to the president. Okay? Now notice the fact that the president follows the Congress means we anticipate the president is a less important figure than the Congress, right? But we choose Washington as our president, right? One reason we choose Washington as our president, fortuitously, we didn't talk about this at the start, but it was very lucky. The framers were, one of the reasons the framers settled on him is that he didn't have children. So to choose Washington risked the likelihood of a hereditary succession, okay? A sort of a Nehru-Gandhi dynasty type thing, okay? Washington, they say the father of the nation was probably sterile, okay? They say all executive power must be vested in a president. So what does that mean? The big executive power is to defend the nation, right? Defend the nation and prosecute federal crimes. So notice the Attorney General is appointed by the President, and the President is in charge, or Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy. He must, or she must in the future, take care that laws be faithfully executed. This is the big issue today. Does taking care of the laws be faithfully executed mean you have to do exactly what the congressional law says without discretion? Okay? Or does it give you the power, like presidents increasingly claim, to have broad discretion on what to enforce, when to enforce it, right? What laws to disregard? And then it says, the president is chosen by electors from each state in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct. So in other words, at the first election, which was, right, 1788, there wasn't a popular vote for George Washington. Each state legislature got together and saying, we're going to choose our electors for Washington. They got together. And from their perspective, there was no need for a popular vote. Why waste your time? There's nobody else. He was a unanimous consensus pick, right? But notice the text says the legislature chooses, right? Makes sense? Okay? It's the starting of the modern electoral college, okay? Notice when you vote for president to this very day, you don't vote for Joe Biden or Donald Trump. You vote for the electors for Joe Biden or the electors for Donald Trump, right? The president must be a natural-born citizen, can't be an immigrant, like, right? And at least 35 years of age. So in other words, you have to be even at a higher age. And why a natural-born citizen? Why can't Alexander Hamilton be president?
He was born on an island, I think?
He was born in Nevis in the Caribbean, so he was the first immigrant founder, right? Hence the musical, right? So he couldn't be president. And I think the framers were concerned that people at this early stage of the Union, if they had immigrant status, like in other words, they might be British, they could be tempted to form an alliance with the UK, right? It could be of dividing loyalties, okay? It's not a very good rationale, right? Not a very good one. Over-inclusive. The president can be removed from office by the Senate for treason. That's pretty bad, can't we agree? Treason, oof. Bribery, oh yeah. But then, other high crime, misdemeanors can be pretty minimal, can't it? Misdemeanor, DUI, gone, right? Right? In other words, what we're empowering Congress to do is have the power to remove a president. Notice there was nothing that gave a president the power to remove a congressman. Right? Congressmen are immune from prosecution, by and large, right? Well, they're traveling to Congress, and they can't be removed by a sitting president, whereas a Congress, if it acts, can remove a president. So think about this. At any moment in time, our elected officials are chosen over 3 different cycles. Right? President Trump, he's elected in November 2024. The entire House is elected in 2024, but 1/3 of the Senate was elected in 2024, 1/3 in 2022, and 1/3 in 2020. Right? So can you see everyone has a different motive? If you think about President Trump, what's the sun, the stars, and the moon for Trump is, I want a strong economy, so I hold the Congress in the midterms, right? Ideally. And I want a strong economy so that I can pass off the torch, potentially, right, to my successor. But because Trump has already served a term, he's thinking, I don't really care about my successor so much as my 4-year term. So strangely, I care about the midterms more than my re-elect chances, right? That makes sense? But then the people who were elected in 2020, they're like, in the Senate, right, they're thinking, or 2024, they're thinking, I'm thinking of a much longer term horizon. I'm worried about 2030. I'm not worried about the next 2 years. That's irrelevant to me. And so that's a useful means of checking public policy concerns, right? Some people will have very short-term time horizons, some longer-term horizons. Okay? Citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens of the several states. What the hell does that mean?
You can cross state lines and
That's right.
enjoy the same benefits.
In other words, when you decided, where did you grow up?
West Tennessee.
Okay. In other words, you could move to Florida, and no one can say, if you've got the money to buy a place in Florida, you're not welcome here, right? But think about what that means, right? Like in China to this very day, there's a huge fight to get a permit to live in what's called a Tier 1 city. In Russia, it's very hard to get what they call a propitska, to live in Moscow, right? But in the United States, you can move wherever you want. And what the framers felt was, the original framers, if you gave people freedom to relocate, that was a much better assurance of good government because people would leave oppressive states in favor of ones that were welcoming. Right? says Congress can propose constitutional amendment with 2/3 vote of each house. 2/3 of state legislatures are needed to call a convention, and then after 2/3 of each house have enacted amendment, 3/4 of legislatures are needed to ratify. Okay? Many countries don't have an amendment formula. Like the Canadian Constitution doesn't have an amendment formula. Our framers gave us one, so it's pretty clear, right? The difficulty is, can you see that's a very high threshold to amend the Constitution? And it's, at the founding, it would have been 9 of 13 states are needed to ratify. But now in our system today, 39 out of 50, or 38 out of 50 is a really high threshold, right? And then look at this. No state, without its consent, shall be deprived of equal suffrage in the Senate. So that's one thing that can't be amended away. Equal suffrage in the Senate. Right? It may be completely unfair to California, but they get the same numbers of senators as Wyoming. Okay? So the ratification of 9 was necessary to establish the United States, which shall consist of all states ratified. So this was controversial because the Articles of Confederation required unanimity. So these are some questions. What was the 9th state to ratify and therefore create the United States? What was the closest to voting no? And which were the last 2? No one tells us these things. The 9th was New Hampshire. Okay? Now that makes sense, right? New Hampshire, they're not a big state. And for them, think of it this way. When you're a small entity, you get a huge benefit joining the larger unit, right? That makes sense? Think of, let's say, the recent Brexit and the EU's negotiation to deal with the Irish question, right? The question with Ireland was, can the British put up a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland now that they've left the EU, right? And for the first time in the entire United Kingdom's history with Ireland, the Irish were in the stronger position. Because the Irish were part of the EU, the British were out, right? And the Irish were able to get the EU to say, the moment a good enters the Ireland, you can't check at the border. If the British want to have access to sell something to France or Germany or Spain, they can't put a border between the Republic and Ulster. See that? Right? And that's the event. When you're a small unit, being part of the larger is useful. That's why New Hampshire signs on. Right? Notice New York is closest to voting no for a good reason. They really don't need it, right? They've got a world port. They've got the startings of a financial center in New York City, which is like Wall Street. It's there. But can we agree in the United States today, California would probably be fine leaving the United States. But Utah would be in a different position, right? Can we agree? And then the two that were the last to ratify are North Carolina and Rhode Island. Rhode Island, they were the most recalcitrant, they were the last, right? But they probably knew once the others said yes, they'd be in a really bad position if they said no, right? It was an inexorable logic to join, right? If the other two, right?
Ultimately, did all of them?
All of them did. All 13 agreed, right? But notice, once you get to 9, you don't want to be on the outside,
Yeah.
right? Right? That makes sense? Okay? You're kind of coerced into saying yes,
Yeah.
right? It's like, will you marry me? Well, do I have a choice? Right? And so these are the Federalists. The Federalist Papers were issued after the Constitution, during the ratification debates. These individuals, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay of New York, he became our first Chief Justice. They were the co-authors. Under the name Publius, they made arguments for ratification. Right? These are the advantages. And this is the arguments that they made. We're creating a republic, right? The Congress, though, which is going to not become a Leviathan because it can only use its enumerated powers to pass legislation. It's never going to do things like tell you how to live, right? And their argument was this, that the benefit of federalism would be, we could have the freedoms of a Switzerland, a small place, but the power of a much larger entity. Make sense? Like a France. Can you see that? We're creating a congressional form of government, and according to Yale Law School professor Akil Rudamar, they didn't allow for secession. Because what they're saying is, what Akil Rudamar's point is, the best argument you could have made at the founding was to tell the states, if you don't like it, you can always leave. It's kind of like going to Best Buy and buying that stereo system you don't need, right? You can return it within 30 days. But our framers never made that argument, which would have been the easiest way to get people to ratify, which according to Akil Rudamar, evidences that secession was disallowed. Okay? Now, of course, that's a bit of a thick argument since they just effectively seceded from the Articles, and the Articles said you can't secede either, right? Right? And then therefore, there was, to go even further, Madison proposed 12 more amendments, right? The House approved 17, the Senate 12, and 10 were ratified by the states in 1791. They were called the Bill of Rights. Okay? And they're basically like, think of this suspenders I'm wearing. They're like an added belt to make sure my pants don't fall down, right? To make sure our freedoms are intact. Okay?
Were the Federalist Papers written before any of those were proposed?
Yes, they were. Yes. So the Federalist Papers were key at the time of the ratification debates. The ratification really was a very democratic form of state legislative action. That they were even more democratic than state elections. And so you'd have these conventions that would vote on ratifying the Constitution. Okay? So these they are. Here, the First Amendment. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, abridging the freedom of speech or the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Journalism professors like my wife say they call it the 5 freedoms: speech, press, assembly, religion, and lobbying. Okay? But if you think about how ingenious this is, right? It says you have a free exercise right to religion, right? But you can't go so far in your free exercise as to make the religion of your state. Think about it, right? Think of, like, notice that goes in tension, like the Iranian people, assuming this is democratic, their free exercise led to the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? You can't do that here. There has to be some means of making sure that your free exercise doesn't lead to religion, the state adopting your religion, okay? There's freedom, there can be no abridgment of the freedom of speech or of the press, right? What they're getting at here is they're understanding that sometimes very, very important discussions can't be swept under the rug to effectively govern. We have to have a free press to traumatize us into the public policy. You hear it, right? Don't some of us hear it from our friends? I just don't want to watch the news, it's too traumatic, right? I can't deal with it, I just want to turn it off, tune it out, be happy. The framers would have said that's not the way, okay? Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. What's the debate we have on that? Liberals take the view that the key language precedes the comma. Isn't that true? The liberal view is what precedes the comma is the operative language. Conservatives take the view what follows the comma is the key language. Isn't that true? And we have elections partly on that issue, don't we? The Third Amendment, we don't really know. It's about soldiers in times of peace being quartered in any house. And because the country became a superpower, we've never tested that, right? In other words, we go to other countries and invade. The Fourth Amendment. This is largely criminal procedure oriented, but it protects against, right? The British would go into people's home and search for things to find out treason. Are you printing, right, radical pamphlets? And Our framers were very offended by that, and they insisted that it could only be done if there's a warrant based on probable cause to do so. Okay? Everyone who's seen a cops and robbers drama knows this, right? The Fifth Amendment is about, right, a whole host of things. One of the things it says, if you want to commence a criminal case at the federal level, it has to be based on an indictment of a grand jury. And right now in Washington, D.C., like think of the case of the guy who threw a sandwich at a police officer. You saw that, right? They couldn't indict him, right? They tried to indict him several times. They couldn't indict him. That's the difficulty. You can't just bring charges against somebody, right? That's hard to do, okay? You can't be compelled to be a witness against yourself. And this is huge. Nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And it also protects private property by saying it can only be taken for public use, and if taken for public use, like we're taking your home to build a road, we have to give you fair market value compensation. We can't just take it for free. Okay? The Sixth Amendment, right? A speedy and public trial and an impartial jury of the state, right? And district where the crime shall be committed. Okay? And you're allowed to assistance of counsel. Make sense? That's why we have, based on this, the Miranda warning, right? The Seventh Amendment says that in a federal trial, even a civil trial, you're entitled to a jury. Okay? The Eighth Amendment disallows excessive bail and disallows cruel and unusual punishments. So some people have taken the view, doesn't that by implication disallow the death penalty? And I think the answer is no. The death penalty is allowed by our Constitution for this reason, that it specifically contemplates capital punishment in the Fifth Amendment. See that? Right? So if it specifically allows for it, you can't make the argument that per se the death penalty is precluded. Okay? The Ninth Amendment says, the enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. It's kind of like, this list of rights is there, but it's not exhaustive. More could exist, right? That's why, for example, many of the judges who started articulating the right to privacy, the right to contraception, and later the right to an abortion, they used the Ninth Amendment as their basis, okay, on top of the 14th Amendment. The 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, right, nor prohibited by the states are reserved to the people, okay, and the states. So that's the Bill of Rights, okay? 3 years later, the 11th Amendment comes in, and it's because Georgia decided to not pay a guy from South Carolina. Okay, it's called Chisholm v. Georgia. This guy named Chisholm from South Carolina said, you owe me money. It didn't work for you, and you stiffed me. So he went to federal court to get paid. The court said pay it. And Georgia got really upset and said, you shouldn't be allowed to adjudicate our budget. They threatened to leave the union early on. And the 11th Amendment came in and said, reversed Chisholm v. Georgia and said, you can't go to federal court and ask for money damages against the state government. Okay? That was one amendment. Now, Bruce Ackerman talks about a succession crisis. In other words, to have a successful constitution, you've got to be able to go from like the popular people to the B team, right? And then you got to survive the B team. What are we talking about? In France, we went from de Gaulle, who was the charismatic leader, and we had to go through Pompidou, right? And then we were able to say the Fifth Republic was successful. South Africa, we went from Mandela, who everybody revered, and you had to go through Thabo Mbeki, right? For the United States, it was going, when Washington announced he wouldn't seek a third term, we had to get through, therefore, the election of 1800, which was a closely fought contest between John Adams, the incumbent president, who was Washington's vice president, and Thomas Jefferson. Okay? That election actually was indeterminate. You needed a majority of electoral college votes, and neither side got it. So it goes to the House of Representatives. Anyone know how we choose a president if no one gets a majority of electors? Like, let's say in Bush v. Gore, Florida's electors weren't counted. How does it go?
Supreme Court?
No, it goes to the House of Representatives, and like the Articles, it's one state, one vote. And the one who wins the most votes becomes president. Does that make sense? And so they had 36 votes in the House of Representatives, and they eventually chose Thomas Jefferson. And so we survived that succession crisis, okay? That was the election of 1800, okay? Now, this was the crazy thing. At the time when we elected presidents then, there was a president and a vice president, but the ballot didn't say so specifically. And the only reason Jefferson won was because 12 electoral college votes from New York went to Jefferson because of his running mate, Aaron Burr. That's how Jefferson beat Adams. Jefferson was also assisted by the 3/5 clause, right? And so when it went into the House of Representatives, Aaron Burr went in and he said, why don't you choose me? Now we see Burr today as a terror. Don't we all, do you ever, anyone see Hamilton the musical? What's our view of Burr? Catiline, right? The murderer of Hamilton. But actually Burr was no trifling figure. Did you know he was actually considered the greatest lawyer in America? Right? He was considered, he, amongst all the framers, was the only one who felt there was no reason why women shouldn't be voting and holding office. He was the one who said, by what standard do we leave it to men? In my experience, there's no, women are no less capable. Wasn't he right?
He was right.
He was right.
Amen.
He was the only one who also said unequivocally slavery was wrong. And we shouldn't have a count, right? Now, of course, he formed an election alliance with the slaveholder Jefferson, but that's a separate issue, right? But we see it as being so terrible. But we see Burr as having been so terrible. My question is, was he really so terrible? Or is that just victor's justice, right? That he was denied the presidency. Okay? And so we got through that succession crisis, and I think that solidified our union. That early moment. I think a lot of things that happen in the world are like happenstance and luck, right? South Africa, I think, is still struggling with the transition to black majority rule because all the subsequent rulers since Mandela have never had the charisma of Mandela, or they've never been quite Mandela morally, or, right? All the other people like Thabo Mbeki, or, right, have always had certain flaws with them, or the current president, right, have flaws with them, okay? But Burr was about to be president, and Alexander Hamilton then intervened at the 36th ballot and said Burr should not be president, and gave the presidency to his nemesis, Jefferson. Now we know what happened at the end of that, right? Okay. So this led to this amendment in 1804, which says now, when we elect a president, we designate someone to be president and one to be vice president. Which means a vice president is separately elected, and we know on the ballot who's supposed to be at the top and who's the bottom. And it also says, okay, based on that, they have to be from different states. Right? That was a means of protecting some dispersion of power. The closest we came to violating that was George W. Bush choosing Dick Cheney as a vice president, because at the time they were both Texans. So Cheney had to immediately change his residency back to Wyoming so that he could comply with the 12th Amendment. Okay? But look at this year, 1804. We have no amendments for the next 61 years, because remember what we need for amendment. We need an overwhelming consensus, but the country is divided by slavery. Right? And so Lincoln comes in, and Lincoln, to preserve the Union, not to abolish slavery, commences a war against the rebellious states of the South. Okay? The reason was not a war to end slavery was the Union featured 4 slaveholding states, right? Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland. Each one, right, joined the war against the Confederacy with the supposition slavery in those states will be protected. Okay? But as the war progressed, Lincoln became more radical in his goals. January 1, 1863, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation as Commander-in-Chief. But the Emancipation Proclamation, he felt, could always be invalidated once there's no longer a war. And notice, to emancipate slaves doesn't protect against the future import of slaves, right? You could always bring in more slaves. So the 13th Amendment comes in, and he says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Make sense? I see that? So we abolished slavery in 1865. Now, a lot of black legal scholars will point out that there's a complete lack of scholarship as to what follows the comma. Because the argument for many black American academics is, effectively during Jim Crow, we would convict people as vagrants in the American South and make them indentured laborers. See that? And so the question is, why did they allow that language to be there? Why didn't they just go, no, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist? Why did they allow what was within the commas to be there, right? Because that was abused in our history, right? I don't have a good answer yet in my research, okay? But it's, I think, largely being neglected in scholarship. A lot of black American law professors are looking at that now. Okay? They're making a point of it. Then you asked about the 14th Amendment. There was a case in 1857 called Dred Scott. In Dred Scott, Justice Taney in the Supreme Court said that a black person cannot be a citizen, even if born in the United States. So the 14th Amendment comes in, and it says all persons born or naturalized are citizens of the United States. But look at what follows the comma, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. See that? The president, in his executive order of January 20th, said he took the view that people who are the children of unauthorized migrants and tourists are not to be considered citizens. Okay? And that's an issue. I looked at the issue. I'm pretty convinced the president's wrong. I think what that language means is it's there to make sure that the children of diplomats or a foreign invading army, or at the time, the children of reservation Native Indians in, let's say, the Western Territory, were not given citizenship. Okay? The Native Indians were given citizenship in 1924 with the Indian Citizenship Act. Okay? Then look what it says too. No state shall make or enforce any law. Notice how different, right? The Constitution before the Lincoln never said to states, no state. It was like come to dinner. Now it's like pay for dinner, right? Okay? And it says, no state shall make or enforce any law which will abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens, nor deprive any state, any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So this, as you said, is what makes states, or like the town of Farragut, subjected to the due process requirements of the U.S. Constitution in dealing with the inhabitants of Farragut, right? Or the city of Knoxville. And it creates a new source of legislative power. It says Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Okay? The 15th Amendment says the rights of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by any state on account of color, race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So that's 1870. Why is it that black people couldn't vote until the Voting Rights Act in 1965 in the South? Or Mexicans couldn't vote in California until the Voting Rights Act? Or Native Americans in North Dakota? It's because Congress never enforced it. See that? Because a lot of Southerners controlled Congress, right? That makes sense? So they never passed that legislation. Okay?
If that section hadn't been in there, that's what makes it clear that they don't have to enforce it. So they put that in there on purpose so that it wouldn't have to be enforced if they didn't want it enforced.
That's perhaps the case. I think also, though, at the time, people at that very moment in our history, that Congress was overwhelmingly an abolitionist, Republican, radical Congress. In their minds, they saw the Congress as the moral actor against the courts or the president, right? President in the 1870s, Andrew Johnson, who they're dubious about. Okay? The 16th Amendment basically says that it creates the income tax. Now, last I checked, Liski, do you like taxes?
Love them.
Okay. Benson, you a corporate insurance guy, probably hate taxes. How on earth did we get a constitutional amendment allowing us to impose an income tax when indeed all of us hate taxes? How was that achieved? Judith, any idea? The reason was, it was the power of the anti-saloon league. And at the time, much of the federal government's revenue came from the liquor tax, the liquor excise. So the anti-saloon league thought the only way we could successfully seek prohibition is if we got the federal government off of the liquor tax. We needed to find a new source of revenue. Okay, that makes sense? The anti-saloon league at that time would be something like the NRA plus APAC plus AARP in one. Right, that makes sense? The biggest lobby. Okay? The 17th Amendment suddenly comes in and says, we elect senators directly. Popular vote for Senate. Okay? No longer chosen by state legislatures. And this has consequences, right? I've talked to someone one time and they said to me, it was during the Bill Clinton, I talked to Congressman John LaFalce. John LaFalce was a New York State congressman, and I asked him about the Clinton impeachment, and he said, if it was an anonymous vote, or if the members of the Senate didn't have to face the public, Clinton would have been kicked out 80-20. He would have been convicted and thrown out, right? But notice, because he's elected, the senators today are elected, they have to face the ballot box, to face the voters. Clinton survived and came out more popular on the back end. Right? 18th Amendment, this is 1990, right? We have the prohibition. See that? Prohibition is enacted. The president at the time is Woodrow Wilson, right? It was largely kind of the Bible Belt versus the urban immigrant population, and the Bible Belt wins. We always see prohibition as a failure. But one thing we don't talk about is prohibition led to a dramatic drop in alcohol consumption compared to, right, the repeal. Okay? The 19th Amendment, it says, women get the right to vote. It doesn't say that. It says, the right of the citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex. It's completely silent as to which sex gets to vote, right? Right? Notice there's nothing in the Constitution that says women can run for office now. It just says you get to vote. Right? Why do you think men agreed to women voting? I mean, last I checked, men like to keep things, right? Do I like to give things up? No.
You have to go home at night.
Yeah, but what are the other factors you think were? One part was the anti-saloon league. The anti-saloon league made the stereotype supposition that women wouldn't drink, but it was the man who came home a drunkard. Is that always true? No. Right? But perhaps. What are the other factors?
There was strong support from the labor unions for women too.
That was true. But also remember the country's moving west. And many states, like in South Dakota and North Dakota, to attract women would offer voting rights to women. It was easier to get a man to move to South Dakota, harder to get a woman, right? Bison, empty fields, right? Right? But if you come here, you get to vote.
Yeah.
And that's how so many states expanded the franchise to women, right? The deciding vote on this amendment came from East Tennessee. Okay? The 20th Amendment, it changes the inauguration date from March 4th to January 20th. Okay? It was basically the anti-Herbert Hoover Amendment. Because the people hated Hoover so much during the Depression, they wanted to have Roosevelt take office earlier. Okay? The 21st Amendment, it's the repeal of prohibition. Right? In other words, it's now the urban immigrant classes now get the drink back. Okay? Notice it doesn't say that liquor is legal. See that? It says the transport, import into any state, right, of intoxicating liquors is prohibited if the state wants to prohibit it. It leaves it to the states. But there's nothing that mandated liquor be illegal. See that? That's why you can have dry counties. Okay? The 22nd Amendment is the anti-FDR amendment. Remember, FDR violated our custom of the president limiting himself to 2 terms by winning the presidency 4 times and then dying in office, right? So it leaves you with 2 terms. And by that text, it means definitively President Trump can't be reelected. That makes sense? Okay. The 23rd Amendment gives electoral college votes to the District of Columbia. So there's no congressman for DC, there's no senator for DC. It's just like a territory like Puerto Rico in that sense, except they get 3 electors for the White House, okay? The 24th Amendment disallows, right, a poll tax as a voting requirement, okay? Now the 25th Amendment, it's interesting. It's to deal with this issue. We all know Lee Harvey Oswald killed President Kennedy, right? But what if Oswald hadn't killed Kennedy, but Kennedy was incapacitated? In other words, he's like Ariel Sharon of Israel. Remember, Sharon had a devastating stroke, but he lived for many years thereafter, right? The 25th Amendment is there if the president is still alive, but incapacitated and unable to do the job. See that? It was the post-JFK assassination, but the Congress had the wisdom to think, what would have happened if JFK wasn't killed, but was just, right, kept on life sustaining? And it says, therefore, when he's unable to do his job, the obligations fall on the vice president. That makes sense? Okay. Now, the mistake we made, you heard a lot of people talk about the 25th Amendment during President Trump's first term, right? But that was a canard, because it always goes back to a president once he has capacity and wants the job back. That was not a solution, okay?
Sorry, what happened before that amendment? What was the role of the vice president?
The role of the vice president was there if the president was dead, killed. There was nothing to say to deal with the issue of a president being incapacitated, like a stroke or right? Right? The 26th Amendment reduces the voting age to 18. It's a Vietnam War event, okay? And then the final amendment is this one, the 27th Amendment. It says, no law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. It was actually one of the original 12 that was passed by Madison, but it wasn't ratified by the states. So this guy named Gregory Watson was a high school student in Texas. He went to his teacher and says, why don't we get this ratified? It's a good idea, don't you think? The teacher says, and he wrote it as his term paper, teacher says that's a stupid idea, C. He then is graduated from high school in Texas and starts writing to legislatures, and they actually enact it and ratify it. So 200 plus years later, it becomes the 27th Amendment, and the teacher, now long into retirement as a senior citizen, she writes the school district and says, there was a guy, now he's in his 40s, but when he was 17 years old, I gave him a C, I wanted to be an A. And they changed his transcript. Right? And that's what happened. His name is Gregory Watson. Okay? But notice we haven't had a constitutional amendment. Okay? So let's look at some questions here, right? President Trump is alleged to have failed to repeal the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. We call it Obamacare. What explains this, right? And I think the wrong answer is it's a broken promise. It's hard to do that, right? That makes sense? Okay? All those reasons, B, C, and D. Okay? Similarly, Biden didn't enact Build Back Better. People were all pissed off, right? Was that a broken promise? Or did he have a lack of sufficient majorities in both houses to do so? Isn't that true? It's hard to do. Okay? So one thing I want you to think of before I close is, one of the things that has happened, though, in our country is, because the threshold to amend the Constitution is so high, what we have done as a resort to change our interpretation is amendment by stealth, by way of judicial nominees. And so now, right, what we tend to have now is a president nominates someone who looks nice and sounds nice and seems upstanding, and they say they can't answer any direct questions because it could be a conflict, but those nominees are intended to interpret the Constitution in a way that effectively amends things without going through the amendment process. That was largely started by FDR, right? FDR, remember, wanted to pack the Supreme Court in the 1930s when the Supreme Court invalidated his New Deal legislation. The interesting thing about FDR, after he won a landslide in 1936, is he could have amended the Constitution with the majorities he had. He had right, here's FDR, he had 60.8% of the popular vote. The Democrats had 334 seats in the House compared to 88 for the Republicans, and they had 75 of 96 Senate seats. Democrats had 38 of 46 governorships, and he could have easily, therefore, enacted constitutional amendments to constitutionalize the New Deal, but he instead chose court packing. And the court packing then ended the moment the Supreme Court justices started to die, and he was able to name new justices. But I think FDR, who many people see as the greatest president of the 20th century, in many ways did the country a disservice, because we now have a tendency to seek amendment through appointment and stealth, as opposed to a candid dialogue with the public as to how the country should change. And that's all. Thank you.